Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Power of Storytelling Amidst the Climate Crisis, brought to you by the Ohio Environmental Council, and in particular, the OEC's Emerging Leaders Program. The OEC's mission is to protect the land, air, and water and democracy of all who call Ohio home. Our Emerging Leaders Program is an opportunity to connect rising environmental professionals and advocates with one another through educational content, opportunities to connect with one another, and collectively advocate on environmental issues like climate change. I'm Chris Tavener. I'm the staff attorney for the Ohio Environmental Council and one of the co-leads for our Emerging Leaders Program. I'm very excited to have the opportunity to facilitate this discussion today. Some people know this, but in addition to my work at OEC, I'm also an author, and a number of my works are climate fiction for hopefully obvious reasons given the mission of the OEC. But enough about myself and the OEC. We are joined by Torrey Stevens from Grist, nonprofit independent media organization dedicated to telling stories of climate solutions and a just future. Grist created Imagine 2200, a climate fiction initiative, which we'll hear a lot more about in just a few minutes. So Torrey Stevens lives in a small railroad town in Massachusetts. He is a resource generator for people, organizations, and movements. Torrey worked as an individual giving campaign director and major donor relationship manager for 13 years before joining Fix, Grist's Solutions Lab, as their network weaver. Torrey has used storytelling in the past to raise funding and awareness for HIV/AIDS, Medicaid and Medicare defense, and to protect the Affordable Care Act. Now, as the project lead of Imagine 2200, Fix's climate fiction initiative, he uses storytelling to champion climate justice. Torrey also owned a kick-butt streetwear company in another life, and he would have gotten away with eating the last cookie too if it weren't for his 3 meddling kids. We'll hear from Torrey soon, but before we get started, I'd also like to introduce the 2 Imagine 2200 authors joining us today. Aydah Patterson is an artist and writer based between Barbados and Rotterdam. She works with masquerade, performance, poetry, textiles, and video, looking at the ways grief, elegy writing, and archiving can be used as tools for disrupting the disappearance of communities queered by crisis. Exhibitions include Life Between Islands, Caribbean British Art 1950s Now at Tate Britain, London. Her writing has been featured in Sugarcane Magazine, Pre, Mr. Motley, and Metropolis M. Mike McClellan is our other author joining us today. Like Sharon Stone in The Zipper, Dr. Mike McClellan is originally from Meadville, Pennsylvania. He has lived on 5 different continents, but now resides in Georgia with his husband, 2 sons, and a menagerie of rescue dogs. He is the author of the short fiction collection Gay Zoo Day, and his creative work has appeared in the New York Times, Wired, Boston Review, Vox, The Baffler, and a number of literary magazines and anthologies. He's a graduate of Allegheny College, the London School of Economics, the MFA program at Georgia College, and University of Georgia's Creative Writing PhD program. Incredible resumes all around. So with introductions out of the way, I'll now turn it over to Torrey to tell us everything we need to know about Grist and Imagine 2200.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Chris. Really appreciate this moment and being able to talk to all of you all. So what is Imagine 2200? What is Grist? And what is the small sub-brand that I work at called Fix? So I'll start with talking about Grist. As you mentioned, it's a nonprofit media organization that's about 20 years old. It was a blog in the beginning, and that's how it started. But now we're a full-fledged media organization distributed across the United States. We were mainly in the Seattle area and had this very Seattle kind of imprint. But over the last 5 or 6 years, we have diversified in a lot of ways, and we're distributed across the United States with kind of like satellites in Washington, D.C., New York, and still Seattle. Those are kind of our anchor areas, but we produce stories and content, and the journalists are focused on news all over the United States that's at the intersections of climate solutions, justice, and the environment. So the organization I am nested at, which is called Fix, it is a part of Grist. It's a sub-brand, if you will. It's a little bit different than telling news, you know. So Grist is focused on the news. If Joe Biden fired the EPA director today, they would have to report on it because it's news and it's really important for the community that we are in conversation with. But we would care about it, but we would be not reporting on it because we're not controlled by the news cycle. We're focused on storytelling. We're focused on climate solutions. And so when I say storytelling, you'll often see a piece that comes out of Fix that does a long background on, we call them sometimes solutionaries, climate solution focused individuals, but you'll learn about like, where did they get that passion from? It'll be a lot more than a news article. So that's the team I'm on. And it was at the beginning of the pandemic, we were searching for how do we broaden storytelling at Grist and Fix? And this idea of a climate fiction initiative came up, but we had no clue what that would look like. So I'm often in community with these folks that we have featured on our what's called Grist 50 list. I don't know if you know it. We just dropped it, the newest one, the most recent one, not Tuesday, last Tuesday. So check it out. There's 50 new climate solution focused individuals from all across the United States. We profile them, but we also bring those folks together for private moments where we have retreats, where we have conversations, sometimes around a theme. Sometimes the idea is just a relationship build, because we do believe that more people in society need to know about not just the people, but the solutions. But I'm a people person, so it's not like, hey, these solutions are it's like the people behind the solutions are gonna get us to this cleaner, greener future. And so we just like to lift those folks up as opposed to kind of say like what Forbes does with like capitalism. We're interested in lifting up folks that are, focused on climate change, fixing climate change and moving it in a direction where it's not this perilous situation. And then also the justice part, which is huge for us. So we were thinking about all these things, and I'm not from the literary world, as you mentioned, Chris, in the intro. I come from a world of storytelling, but it was so short term. It was I was a fundraiser, so like every few months you have to raise funds, and like the stories I was telling were about like we need money to help folks with HIV and AIDS right now. All right, and the difference between that and like what I'm doing now puts me in a whole different space. We're looking at like futurism, visionary stuff. Like I was out of my shell. So what I decided to do is bring together a whole bunch of people and talk about what would a dynamic climate fiction contest look like at Grist. So we had you can't get away with this now, but at the beginning of the pandemic, we had a 3-day Zoom, a retreat, because we have 3-day retreats, but they're usually in this beautiful scenery, in the mountains, wherever, like somewhere nice that people are kind of like tantalized by the space and then all the people that are there and what we're talking about. And so we did this on Zoom, but one of the facilitators we were working with said, why don't we combine this vision exercise about thinking about what this climate fiction initiative could be with a role-playing game? And I was like, wait a minute, what? I'm not like a person that came from the D&D world or whatever. So I didn't really like get that it was like, you do like story building and world building while you're playing. So we mashed those two things together. And then over the course of 3 days, these folks who are focused on like a variety of climate solutions, from kelp farmers to all the way to like, activists on the front lines in Louisiana, we all like we put 4 people in a room and they had to use a Miro board, which is like an online whiteboard, and get to a clean, green, and just future by 2200 collectively with their talents. And they essentially went on like this wizard and warrior kind of quest, but in a climate solutions way. So after we had all that information, I went into kind of like a hibernation thing where I just like kind of like all the information, pulled it together, and then just started writing up with a whole bunch of other people what this initiative would look like. And so what we, the bones of it, the foundation after all that conversation was that there's going to be a strong justice element to this initiative. It's going to be intersectional because people's lives are intersectional. We want it to be dynamic in 3D. So we know that characters that you see in TV, or at least like my growing up, even now with my children, when I look to put on a TV show, the character's great, but there's not many black and brown characters. And they're not, and if they're black and brown, they don't have that other parts of themselves that are brought into the space. So an individual could be queer. Why isn't the main character black and brown and queer? And also fighting against a system that is oppressive. So that's what we wanted to do, imbue the project with this intersectional approach where we're putting the power relations of people's like lived experience and identity as the character should be if they're living out on the front lines of a community. So with all that said and done, we put the prompt out into the world. It was global. We got stories from all around the world. 85 countries were at the table in a sense, like who submitted. And 1,100 stories came in. And in the end, we selected 12 amazing stories that represented that prompt that we put into the world. I think all the stories are very intersectional and have resilient and strong characters that you can really relate to if you're a person who hasn't seen yourself in climate fiction or even just storytelling broadly. So I could probably go on about the project forever because I love talking about it, but I want to like get into it a little bit with others and hear some of the bits that folks are going to read today.
Thanks for that overview, Torrey. So quick apologies to people as they're rolling in, either through Facebook Live or Zoom. It sounds like we had a slight issue with the Zoom join link that people were sent out, but hopefully more people are rolling in now. But hopefully others are tuning in via Facebook Live if that's working better. So just as a reminder, throughout the discussion today, feel free to put questions in the Q&A or the chat feature on Zoom. If you're on Facebook Live, feel free to comment and ask a question that way. We'll have time for Q&A at the end. So feel free to bring those questions in. And when we get to that section, we'll be fielding those questions up, whether you're on Facebook Live or Zoom. So with that clarification, before we dive into a discussion surrounding climate fiction, we'd actually like to take a moment to allow the authors to read short excerpts from their stories. Hopefully a few people that are joining us today have already read the Imagine 2200 stories. I've loved the ones I've read, but if not, hopefully these excerpts will give you a reason to explore Imagine 2200 a little bit more fully after our discussion today. So Aydah, you're up first.
Thank you. So I'm going to read an excerpt from my story, Broken from the Colony. How do you grow up on an island without ever learning how to swim? She asked it without judgment. It was something driven by a child's curiosity. Knowing how to swim wouldn't have saved any of them. She knew that, of course. Nobody could outswim a hurricane. Yet the question still troubled her. Every time there was a drowning, the island would swell in grief. Local and tourist alike had been claimed by the sea. But death never seemed to play fair when it came to the lives of her people. From this, she reasoned that death must be a tourist too, that or a hotelier. She knew how her people got here. It wasn't a secret for her generation. Ships brought their ancestors in all kinds of chains, but she didn't think any more sense could be wrung from that journey. That is, any sense that hadn't already been written to death, that hadn't written her people to death over and over and over again. Why would she rub Manganiel in her eye in the hope of understanding it? And after all that senselessness, this little rock of horrors, trembling in the Atlantic, suddenly had to hurtle itself into a society. That question again making her seasick. How do you grow up on an island without learning how to swim? Its shadow mocked her and her people. Why would property need to swim? Where would it need to swim off to? She grew suspicious of the drops of white in her that made these questions all too easy to imagine. She feared her blood for what it could want if hers was not the body to hold it. She tried to salvage something from the wreckage of that journey. Who the hell would want to swim after all that horror on the water? It still wasn't enough to soothe her. She couldn't leave her people stranded there like that. She looked to what was left of all the chattel houses that used to hug the road too tightly. There was hardly anything there to remember them. All their wood had drifted. Waves of galvanized paling rusted into loss. Only foundations remained. Rows of concrete steps going nowhere fast. Portals of memory drowned in the sea. Some of the yards were haunted with statues and bird baths. A mold of some nameless little white boy with a basin on his head. The same child cast in concrete and painted enamel white to live in every single yard on the island. She could see his pristine whiteness didn't last. He was encased in the blades of sea fans and an ooze of pink coral. Sea stars nested in his basin. Not a bird in sight, just shoals of fish floating around, indifferent to this child's drowning. The question haunted her again. She knew how much love she had for the island. Only her people could rival her in that, but she never wanted to be stuck there or anywhere. She could never reconcile that there were those who didn't want or need to leave, those that didn't need to swim. Where would they go? Where would they need to go if the land had everything they needed? That little rock could be enough for them, and this thought stirred her like a hurricane. She clenched her fist and teeth. All she wanted was to hold her little rock in her hands and know it was enough. She tightened around the memory and could feel it warming in her fist. But that rock and her people stared back at her ugly, ugly, ugly. There was no love grown for girls like her. A cold reminder that bloodied her hands with urchin thorns. She knew it would never be enough. Every day before Dorian, she had stepped off island and into the water. She needed to float in everything that wasn't landlocked or left for dead. Every horizon was a possibility. Every black depth, a promise that stranded was not the only way to live. And when Dorian came, the water stepped into her. They had broadcast the disappearance to the rest of the region. A whole island gone, no sign of survivors, which was true. Nobody made it out the same. They say the sea has no back door, but for girls like her, the sea was their back door. Girls growing soft with gills, pores, and polyps, just as they had grown otherwise. That little pill, that little piece of care, was one of the keys to their survival. Breath had been found underwater. As above, so below, changing in the ways they needed to. And the sea, so choked with plastic, she changed too. Toxic microbeads, hormonal plankton, water in transition. Everything it held changed. She knew what it was like to suffocate, both her and the sea. And so she breathed what she could once the air began to thin. Oxygen depleted, estrogen on tap, a different kind of breath for a different kind of life for a different kind of girl. They were one inside each other, she and her, the sea and her, she and all the girls who made it through, a plural her of infinite pleasure. Everything wet was her. She oozed back into memory. Thank you.
Thank you, Aydah. Hopefully, people, as they heard Aydah's words, that story, you're feeling the themes and the narratives that and the character that was really invested into that narrative. And if that excerpt intrigued you, you can read the whole story after the discussion completes, and we'll have time to talk a little bit more about Aydah's story a little later. But now let's hear from Mike. Mike, the stage is yours.
Thank you, and terrible to go after Aydah. I'm such a big fan, so bear with me. Okay, my story is called "The Secrets of the Last Greenland Shark," and I'll be starting right about the beginning. It was a kind of salve to the spirit, a bit of anesthetic applied to the extreme trauma of being the last of your line. I felt it immediately, the very second I became the last human alive. A sideways stretch of the mind, immediate access to the final moments of every other extinct species. It meant, of course, that we weren't alone. Even though we'd soon be gone, this was proof that there was indeed someone or something else in charge, something watching out for us all, or at least watching us all. Accessing it was a bit like one of those old-fashioned electronic devices. I had to sort of scan leftward with my mind to get to the next species, though it worked in tandem with my own imagination. If I could think of the creature itself, the last aardvark, for instance, I could zip directly to it, or if I knew the category, birds or flightless birds or tropical birds, I could land there and search around within that realm. I started with wasps because I was eating a fig when every other human being died. We hadn't had wasps or bees for decades, but the crunch of a small bioorganic pollinator in the center of my fig reminded me that making figs had once been a task for wasps. I'm sure there was a scientific structure to it, but I'm no scientist. I just appreciated it for what it was, the ability to finally reach out and communicate across species, to share the eyes of a lion, snake, or mole, to feel the wolf's fierce capacity for love, the sheer intelligence of the octopus, the spider's unfathomable ingenuity. Some of the lasts were still alive, and we could join with one another for a while, though there was a natural timer on each session. I could feel myself starting to feel more of the animal's feelings more than my own, and the energy that made this possible would begin to nudge me back into myself. When it happened, I'd been out fishing and had stopped to eat my figs in the shade of Booby, a small island in the Narrows. I'd set out from Old Best-Terre that morning and followed a tip into the Narrows, where there'd been a number of sea turtle sightings. I risked being picked up by the New Best-Terre authorities for trespassing into their waters, but we were too hungry to worry about risks. From my view, it seemed as if Old Best-Terre and New Best-Terre had been yanked down into the earth by some subterranean beast. A wall of water erupted around the northern island, then the same happened to the southern island, and both disappeared beneath the water, the earth letting out a misty, rocky belch as it sucked the last human cities into the ground. At first, I thought it could have been a bomb that did it. New Best-Terre had finally done what it had been threatening to do, or Old Best-Terre had tried to preempt their attack. But a bomb didn't seem right. It had looked more natural, more inevitable than that. Instead, I wondered if the earth had simply grown tired of carrying us. Perhaps the ground cracked in crisp lines beneath the cities like eggshell under a pressing thumb, and then fell into nothingness below. I don't think it had ever occurred to any of us that we were the last humans alive. We were sure that some of the folks who had gone underwater, beneath the ground, or into space had survived. We just knew that there had to be another group of humans out there tucked away in Australia or Mongolia or in some snowy corner of the Himalayas. But then our cities were gone, and I was marooned on a lone peak between their deep grave. A great hole opened up all around me, my island pillar of a volcanic rock that had somehow been spared. The Greenland Shark. When the birth rate plummeted, humans became obsessed with animals with long lifespans. The Greenland shark, rumored to live up to 500 years, was chief among them. I was curious to see if any had survived the carnage in the oceans, the heating, then the draining, then the flooding. The erasure had taken away nearly all the world's water, but as we'd learned, the deepest recesses of the ocean had been spared. And when that water reappeared in the cataclysm and destroyed most of the remaining human cities, we had almost no way of seeing what survived in the oceans. Everything we tracked and mapped had been drowned, diluted, distorted beyond comprehension. We'd been left alone, really alone, as I now know, in Old Bastere and New Bastere, able to only focus on day-to-day survival. There was one left. She still lived. These creatures, the other still living lasts, were especially dear to me. I knew they sensed my presence when I visited them, just as I sensed theirs. I made sure to enjoy something when I felt one visit. A bite of grapefruit, a sip of rum, a smell of lily. I wanted to give them the best of what it was to be human. I knew they could go back along my timeline, see my spouse, see the children we raised in our small village with Old Bastere. They could see the joys of my life, and I hoped they sought refuge in my joy just as I did theirs. Because my own was too raw at the end. I couldn't bear to live in my own memories, and being able to escape them was yet another gift from whatever force connected us last. When the Greenland Shark visited me, I could feel her sliding up and down the years of my life. She had a cold, thick, curious presence. And when I joined her, I had 500 years to traverse. The things she had seen. She'd been born in the golden age of pirates and had come close to the surface to watch a number of battles. She loved when boats caught fire and she could feel the tendrils of warmth slide into the water. She kept her distance, but she relished the story she could pick up from pieces of burnt wood, from the sinking sacks of grain and barrels of spirits. I found one memory in which she was near death. Even back then, early in her life, the earth was changing for the worse, and she had trouble finding food. In every memory I found, in every moment I spent visiting her, she was seeking something. She was a born seeker, a natural wanderer, though I don't know if there was one thing she was looking for or if she simply moved from one goal to the next. I could see through her eyes and physically feel some of what she felt, but visiting didn't mean I could read her mind. With other living lasts, I could get a vague sense of what their thoughts and emotions were. And eventually I learned to guess what lasts, living and dead, were feeling based on what it was they remembered. But she was mostly a mystery to me. In this long ago memory of hunger, she was forced towards shallow waters, which she usually avoided. She came across a boat, but it was excruciating because she knew there was food somewhere within, but she had no way of getting to it. She wasn't capable of giving up hope. She would pursue sustenance, pursue life, until she simply ran out of it. But she was aware that she hardly had any chance of survival. Then a human body tied at the wrists and ankles fell on top of her. The pirates had sent someone to walk the plank, and he'd walked right off the edge and into her waiting jaws. There was something pulling at the outer edges of her feelings while she ate the wriggling prisoner. She didn't often eat living things. She preferred to eat the preserved carcasses of Arctic creatures that died of old age. But she had to eat to live, and this human was her last chance. It was getting close to time for me to leave, and I was enjoying the feeling of my teeth biting into human flesh. It wasn't like chewing, it was like scratching an itch in my gums by sawing them together. The way his warm blood heated her cold body was a feeling that could not be understood within the human body. But the act of eating something so alive, so tendinous and bony, was unsavory to her. And then I realized what she was feeling when she ate that bound human. She wasn't sorry exactly, but she did feel a certain amount of regret. As I sank into the feeling, it seemed almost as if she felt that that meal hadn't been earned. She was a creature who needed to find things, to seek. One thing outweighed the need to seek, however, and that was the need to survive.
Thank you, Mike. Hopefully, everyone is starting to get the feel of how climate fiction can really ground readers deep in a narrative designed to shift how you think about the world, about the experience of individuals and characters as they confront the climate crisis that we are all collectively facing. So now it's time for us to dive into discussion, talk about climate fiction and Aydah and Mike's stories. For the audience, as you listen, feel free to drop questions in the chat for the Q&A. We'll have time after our planned discussion questions to dive deeply into what you all are taking from their stories or from the other things that we talk about here. And for those of you who are on Facebook Live watching that way, feel free to drop questions there as well, and we'll be able to pull them into the conversation, hopefully. So let's start first with your two stories. What was the inspiration for your particular stories? And what are you hoping readers will take away from your words? And maybe it's that you don't have a particular thing that you hope that they take away from your words. Maybe you hope people take many different things based on their own personal experiences. But, really tell us about what drove you to write your stories. Let's start with Aydah.
Thanks for the question. So I wrote this story while I was doing some work in Barbados. And yeah, it was sort of a few months after I started hormone therapy. And sort of a few months into this process, like, I guess the feeling that I associated with it was like, finding breath in an unbreathable circumstance, or almost like breathing underwater. And like, a few months into this process as well, because of like the pandemic, the sort of strain on the supply chains, like already delicate supply chains, like when trying to import things into a small island in the Caribbean. Like a lot of medication was not reaching the island, including the estradiol tablets that I was taking, and that I'm sure many trans people are taking in Barbados, and also not trans people, because it's also like for some women take the same medication as well as the cis women. And so there was a hormone drought, and I wanted to kind of write a story that was in a way a kind of prayer of abundance, an abundance for myself and people like me who suddenly kind of got their life-saving medication like withheld from them by global circumstances. And the sort of, the global level of that kind of impact like also reminded me of, kind of being caught in the crosshairs of, I don't know, geopolitical situations, being caught in the crosshairs of climate crisis, where if you're from a small country with a low carbon footprint, it might be difficult to reconcile something like climate crisis when you can't really do anything, or like where the bigger impact rests with larger countries, bigger world powers. So I wanted this story to just be this like, this prayer for something else, this space of, I don't know, recognizing that my region is like more and more at risk of drastic change or disappearance by climate crisis, intensified hurricanes, sort of trying to hold that reality and that possibility, while also trying to make a space where breath for trans girls, for trans feminine people, was abundant as the water that was soon going to come for our islands. I think, that was the basic sort of premise for writing this. And I think like what I wanted to leave with, I guess, readers, just a knowledge that that I exist, that people like us exist. Our communities don't receive the sort of care or attention that they rightly deserve, not only in Barbados, just across the world, I would say. But also to make aware the fact that, yes, the region is like completely at risk, even though I have like a complicated love to the place that I come from. I can't ignore the fact that its disappearance is less threatened and more promised because of climate crisis. So I was hoping my story could be a kind of a way of, making these things known.
Yeah, thank you, Aydah. I think I'll say, as someone who's read your story, I think you do communicate that. And one of the reasons why I think it's really important for people who are living, say, in Ohio to hear your type of story is that, like, Ohio is a place that isn't going to feel the same sort of impacts of the climate crisis as small island nations and places like that. And like, that's the sort of real story that's like, look, this is why we need to take action now, because like there are real places and real people whose lives are much more at risk than people here in Ohio. Even though Ohioans have risks that will come from the climate crisis, there are other places that it's even more extremely present in the here and now. So thank you for sharing that. And Mike, your thoughts?
And I refuse to follow Aydah again. This is terrible. That was wonderful, Aydah. I really that was really powerful. Especially, I love the story, so that was so cool to hear the motivation as well. I'll just say that I want to give credit to where there was actually an incredible article in the New Yorker. It's called "The Strange and Gruesome Story of the Greenland Shark." By M.R. O'Connor, and that's actually where I got a lot of my interest in the Greenland shark. The story itself had actually been with me for a long time, and I think those of you that are we're all writers and artists in our own way, and we get our ideas sometimes a long time before they come to the page. So this is a particular story that was with me for years. That I just thought, what if you were the last person on Earth, which people think about all the time, but I was like, what if it wasn't the most depressing thing? Like, what if you suddenly realize, oh, I can talk to all these, animals, or at least think like them. And then when I saw the call for submissions for this particular, the Imagine 2200 contest, I was like, okay, it's time to actually write this story because there's somewhere I can send it. And so I finally decided to put pen to paper. And originally when I thought about it, I was going to write about somebody and his dog, because I love my dogs and stuff. So I was like, it'll be that. And then I was like, oh gosh, it has to be the Greenland shark. There's no other animal that it could be. And especially knowing that, the Greenland shark had persisted basically in isolation. They live very lonely lives for, they've measured it now, about 500 years. I just thought I wasn't trying to go too hard on the analogies, but I thought, oh my gosh, like imagine, thinking that, oh my gosh, I have to be alone for a few weeks as the last human. And here's this animal that lives 500 years alone, in the cold, so I wanted to be like, well, here you are, dying alone, well-fed on the beach, which is still terrible, but, it's like, contrasting that with the shark and then the other last animals as well. And I think what it really came down to, and what I loved about this particular contest and this call for submissions and what it got people writing about, was this idea of hopefulness. And I wanted to take it kind of as far as I could, because I think especially since I've become a father, and I don't want to sound like too much of a cliche, but since my husband and I adopted our sons, I suddenly started, I always cared about the environment. It's always been very important to me, but I suddenly felt a lot sadder about what we've done to the environment. You're like, oh my gosh, what are we leaving for them? And even though I didn't bring my children into the world to prepare them to be in the world, has been so scary, especially entering the pandemic. My boys are both toddlers, so we've been living it. And I just thought, how can I prepare them, even if this is the last? Sounds really, really depressing, but what if they're the last generation? What if this is the end? How can I prepare them to be happy? How can you be happy at the end? And that was the inspiration for this story, was finding happiness at the end. So even though the story does include, spoiler alert, a lot of deaths, it's hopefully can bring a smile to readers' faces. And that's what I loved about a lot of these projects, is that it found hope. And I loved what Aydah said, a prayer of abundance. I think that kind of messaging, these kind of prayers of joy and acceptance at the end can be really powerful. So it was such a great opportunity to explore that.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, one of the things that I really took from your story was also the idea of just really emphasizing the connection that humans truly have to all other living organisms. I think that was one of the things that stood out to me, where it's like, oh, imagine recognize that, us as the cause of climate change, and there's all these other living organisms that are going to be the last, possibly because of that. And I thought that was really powerful. Actually, I'm looking at our question list, and I think you both kind of already answered the second question. So I'm actually going to move on to our next one. For those that are listening, it was what drew you to write a story for Imagine 2200 in particular. And I would say, I think that's you've both kind of illustrated that already. So in your mind, and Mike, we'll have you go first this time. What's the relationship between storytelling and environmental advocacy? So OEC is an environmental advocacy organization. We're going and trying to change policy to combat things like climate change. And how do you see storytelling, and in particular fictional storytelling, because that's what you both have written here, even though there is those elements and grains of truth in the stories, what is that relationship between fictional storytelling and environmental advocacy? How can they work together to move people to act, if at all?
That's a great question, and I think it's really powerful for me personally, just because I think the things I care most about and that I've learned about the most have been through fiction. I don't have a great mind for non-narrative nonfiction. Like I've been in school for 4,000 years, so I mean, I guess some of it sticks, but I just I've always struggled with the history books, and so. Historical fiction for a long time was a great way to learn history. And then as I got older and started turning, and I think life has become, the market has become easier. It still has a long way to go for people who are different, but I was learning about different people and people that were different like me, and then people who are much more different through fiction. And that's been the story of my whole kind of life as a learner. And so then to be a part of it and to get myself thinking, but then to be able to do it with my own work has been really powerful as a writer, because I think you always have this, everybody, especially right now, since we're living in so much isolation, has this question of what I'm doing, is it important? And I don't necessarily know that what I'm doing is important, but I feel more powerful. I feel stronger about it, more strongly about it. I feel like I'm contributing something more if I'm exploring these things. And so for a writer, it entertains a curiosity in me a lot, but also connects me to the world that's actually doing a lot of work. So even if I am just recording it, I think at least you get these ties. And I think what a lot of writers, what we need to think about on both sides, and that's why even just what we're doing today is so wonderful, is that there's a lot of organizations out there with different resources and different expertises that can connect, and they can reach new audiences. And some of those are, I've worked with larger, organizations like I know the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is one that they have lots of money, and so they're reaching out and working with artists to get the word out about certain initiatives that are in line with them. And so it's certainly another way where we can cross paths with people in different disciplines. And I think that's so important for any artist, but I think it's important for the world, just because we all have such different brains. And so I found that, especially with this topic, which is so vital and important right now, to be a writer engaging with it really puts you in contact with the pulse of creative energy and also societal energy, like we're all, it connects us all, if that doesn't sound too wishy-washy, but that's what I love about it.
Could you repeat the question, please?
Yeah. In your mind, what's the relationship between fictional storytelling and environmental advocacy? How can they work together to move people to act?
I'm asking you to repeat because I'm going to struggle with this question. Yeah, I guess with my own story, I'm not very hopeful. Aside from writing something down and knowing that it exists and hoping that the record will outlive me or survive long enough to make a difference. I think in relation to environmental advocacy, I think what climate fiction does or like, I guess, hopefully good climate fiction does is draw on the things that are completely fully possible, but not only possible, but are either already happening or are definitely going to happen. Not as a kind of a sort of like for alarmist purposes or whatever, but just to say like, yeah, our world is doing these things right now, and we are doing these things to our world, and to sort of bring a sense of honesty to that. And so I think like for example, the sea in my story gives breath to trans girls, and this idea of actually like relating it to the to estrogen. I'm referring to this phenomenon, which is already like, we already live this reality where all our water is full of like plastic microparticles, and chemically, like what these are doing to our own bodies, like our bloodstreams and whatever, like they mimic estrogen. They sort of mimic, they block our hormone receptors as well. So they have like estrogen-like effects to our bodies. I am not a scientist, just saying. But my point in raising this is to say, like, I'm referring to a thing that's already here, a reality that it's not fictional. What I'm doing with it is fictional, of course. But I think it's kind of like, what I enjoy about good storytelling is how seductive it can be, and how much it can teach you through different kinds of references, while still trying to be like accessible, rather than too like, I don't know, too dense or something like academic writing or something like that. I think seductive fiction, people can access a lot of ideas that they wouldn't have otherwise accessed. And I think when it relates to climate fiction, you start to realize or start to have a clearer picture of what's going on in the world and in different pockets of the world as well. And I guess as it relates to environmental advocacy, like my only hope is that it brings a sense of urgency. It raises the stakes, it raises each of our like individual stakes and communal stakes in a world that we are sharing, and in a world that like these effects that to different degrees we're all complicit in. So that's how I see it, at least.
No, thanks. I think both of you provided really great insight and perspectives into what the storytelling can do to move. One of the things that I think this kind of resonates with both of what you were saying is like, I'm an attorney. That's what I like. That's my profession. But like, one of the reasons why I like storytelling so much, and in particular climate fiction, is that it gives that opportunity to try and envision worlds that maybe like, you know, slightly in the future or whatever, that are responsive to what is happening now, to try and like give those narratives and stories and ground them in characters experiencing those stories that like say like this is a possible reality that we could move toward, to invest in that sort of hope. And it almost is like thought experiments where you're like, hey, what is that world that we could create together if we all had the will to pursue it? And I think but like at the same time grounding it like, hey, this is what's happening now. This is the experiences that people are having now. And remember that even as we try and think about, you know, a possible future 30 to 40 years from now, like there's also things that need to be changed in the moment. Yeah, Torrey, I'm just real quick. Do you have any thoughts to add on to that question from your perspective?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we at Fix consider ourselves, or the project, a narrative shifting project, right? So one of the biggest narratives that we aimed at when this project was first, not the Imagine project, but the Fix project 5 years ago when we launched the Grist 50, is that we want people to understand that there's climate solutions out there. They exist. There's pathways to get out of this problem that we're in. It's complex, but we want more people to be investing their time, attention, and their dollars towards funding and activating people who are focused on these climate solutions, right? The solutions exist, and we believe that if we activate and get those solutions more known, if more people can know about those solutions, there will be more hope for the overall project of us getting to a clean, green, and just future. So storytelling, I think, like Mike said, plays a big role in that. There's a lot of people who are just not activated by statistics and news, right? When I was on the policy side of things, I used to always say, get rid of, like, they would come to me with, we raised, not we raised, but 1 million more people got, this is when I was working for helping defend the Affordable Care Act. And a lot of the folks wanted to lead with 1 million more people were able to get healthcare, or 5 million people. But that's a great number, but it gets lost in people's heads. Like, everyone interprets math differently, but stories with emotion, not that everyone interprets it the same, but that raw emotion I think is more effective than statistics. So I would always want to lean on the story of just the one person that was helped and talk about their story about how they were helped by the Affordable Care Act. And you saw some of these kind of stories in the messaging that came out like that. But so that's how I think these stories work as well. They connect you in an emotional way. They're hitting a different part of your brain, and they activate a different person. Someone like Mike, who is just not interested in the news as much, or interested in kind of history. It's just like, kind of like, they're done with that, and you can still get really good information from fiction. Like you can live someone else's, or you not live someone else's life, but you can see the perspective. With Aydah's story, there's a moment in that story where I just was like moved so much and learned so much multiple times. But the one instance that I would like to call out is the checkout line moment, where the father is in the checkout person is describing the woman or daughter, the girl, as a son, and the reflections that she is seeing and the changes in her body that she can see herself, but no one else is aware, or they choose not to see those. And it just was like, I'm not going to be able to draw those kind of perspectives on my own. And so the fiction, which is drawn from probably real experiences, helped me understand that person's life.
And one of the things I really liked that moment too, for a lot of the same reasons, Torrey, but Aydah, I'd be curious one of the things that stood out to me about that moment too was, in my mind, because this is a story grounded in climate fiction, it also reminded me of all the people that are not recognizing that the climate crisis is even impacting people. And it was like a very interesting parallel analogy in my mind. And you may not have intended that, but that is like, I was getting that parallel narrative at the same time.
Yeah, I think with that moment in the story, like, I just wanted to build up the fact that, the story isn't only about like a girl who finds new life underwater, or a group of girls who find new life underwater. It's also a story of immense loss for people who are wiped away, like, out of existence through the passage of a hurricane. And it's like, in the sort of, in the nature of that scene, it's like people are preparing for a hurricane as they usually do. It's like, it's also to say that hurricanes are not an unusual circumstance for the Caribbean region. We expect them to arrive. They are a familiar guest. It's just that we can no longer deal with them on this level because they are becoming so like intensified by climate crisis. So it's like this familiar guest is no longer familiar. We can no longer hold and receive this guest in the same ways that we've been used to. And so with that sort of, that scene, it's sort of to say, it's the tragedy of like not knowing of a whole population of people not knowing what's about to come, regardless of their views on like the situation of climate crisis. Like it will come for you, and that's the kind of harrowing part.
For sure. And that kind of brings us to a question that we have from the audience. Someone says, does climate fiction necessarily convey a sense of hope? And I'm curious what Aydah and Mike think about that question. And also knowing what the purpose of Imagine 2200 was from Torrey's perspective too. So what do you all think? Does it necessarily convey a sense of hope?
I'll jump in for this one because I think like that is where we put our kind of plant our flag in the ground and say that we want it to be a place where hope is, this. I'm interested, and this is something that's very personal to me that I've been walking recently, which is collectively talking about in community, what does hope mean? Because on the back end, when we were reviewing these stories, there was some really dynamic in, we argue because we're trying to get to like this question, like what is hopeful? In, looking at Mike's story and being like, let's talk about that. Is it hopeful? And there's seeds of hope in there for sure, but there's a lot that's not, but we didn't want a hope that was kind of unrealistic or not honoring how much peril we're in. So we were okay with some that slid kind of further in a different. There's multiple hopes out there, is what I guess I want to say, and so you have to hold those in different ways. So yeah, I think like the project, not just Imagine, but for a lot of us out there, is that we're addicted to dystopia. In this country, I would say that I feel like I can say that. I can say that as a person who is also addicted to dystopia, right? Even though I manage this like hopeful initiative. And part of that is to be like, I want to see more stories out in the world. I'm fine with there being dystopian stories out there, but can there be like more hopeful stories? Or just like, if you're someone who writes a dystopian story, can I motivate you to put your pen down or pick it back up and write in different vein for the next 5 movies you write, stories, comic books, whatever whatever it may be. The goal for me is just to activate more people to dream of hopeful, solutions-oriented, intersectional climate fiction stories.
I'll just add that I think that was one of the wonderful things that stood out about this particular project, and I was so grateful for what they're doing, and then also what they're doing with their list of the 50 individuals, because I think it highlights these hopeful stories, and I think it is. I found myself sometimes turning away from dystopian stories because the ending's too happy. And I'm like, well, they just put that on so they could sell it, like it was like, that's not what's going to really happen. But, I thought that was such a great challenge. I would also say just, and I think you folks in Ohio probably have some of this regional connection also. I grew up very close to where Rachel Carson lived, and she wrote Silent Spring. And I found that to be, even though it was like really a damning book, about the way we're treating the environment, and this has been 50 years, still very hopeful in the delivery, because it was a call to action, and so that was like in my regional writerly blood just from the beginning, and so I wanted to, not to make my writing too grand. I mean, I write a lot of like smut too, but I just was like, oh, I want to take this, how do we learn? How do we make a call to action through fiction? I wasn't trying to get anybody to do anything with my story, but I did think, oh, it'd be nice when you're reading this if you identify with the animals as much as the humans, just as a fun kind of narrative thing. But I think infusing that into climate fiction is important, whether or not that's hopeful, or you're getting somebody you can get them to do something. I don't think that necessarily is the goal for art always, but I think it's still a nice thing to have if you have a way to do it, to say this is some way you could act, or this is some way you could think. you know.
I'll also just add, yeah, I didn't think my story was going to get selected because I didn't think it was very hopeful. At the same time, like looking back to it, I think it sort of opened up a lot of questions around, yeah, firstly what hope is, and then also what kinds of hope can different people afford. Like, I think a happy ending that where everything is okay is a luxury that only some people can access. And I think some of us can only hope for so much. And that isn't to say that we let despair sink in. It's just about sort of being hopeful that we'll be able to live with what happens. Maybe surviving is hopeful, like is hope enough. And I think like with my story, it was very much just trying to locate hope somewhere else, to decenter hope from like a reality which I don't think is possible, and try and invest that into a different location, which in the story meant underwater for trans girls who don't have a lot of hope surviving in this world, to reinvest my hope in that, and to reinvest my hope in a world where even if it was completely turbulent and still precarious and still delicate, that the reasons for that turbulence were not tied to reasons of like transphobic violence or whatever. I think it's sort of reconciling that you don't need to write or imagine a utopia to be hopeful.
Yeah, that's a great line that you just ended that with. That you don't need to imagine utopia to be hopeful, because I think utopia is like one of those things that is like, sure, it'd be great if we could achieve it, but is that a realistic thing for us in any given moment to really believe is possible? And so we're at 1:03, so we've got about 12 minutes left. So I want to encourage people that are in the audience, if you have any final questions for our authors and for Torrey, please slip them in. But while people might be trying to slip any final questions in, I do have one for us all to think about. So there might be future climate fiction writers in the crowd, whether on Facebook Live or here on Zoom. But what advice would you have for them as they consider writing a story, maybe even for this second round of submissions for Imagine 2200, especially because you two are authors that got stories accepted. And selfishly, I submitted one last year and did not get all the way to the end, but so maybe I'll be able to take some pieces of advice from the two of you.
I can just I would say I'm terrible with advice. I'm always like, do nothing, do everything, do nothing. But I would say, just write about something you're actually interested in. I think I've tried at different times to delve into different areas of different subject matter or things that I think are important, and just gotten kind of stuck. But with this, I just was like, oh my gosh, I'm really into this Greenland shark. Like, I just want to write about it. So it was like, and then it just flowed out, so I don't think you need to obviously a lot of really important subjects touch our lives, and this is an important topic to write about. But I think as a storyteller, making sure you can tell when your writer is interested in what they're writing about or when it matters to them. And I think that's what was so powerful with the stories I read in this collection, was like, these are all, it's funny, like, mermaids show up in a few, which I loved. I was like, we're all really into mermaids, but things that get you passionate, you can tell as a reader. And so, I think that just made it so much fun to write. I have such a great feeling about this whole experience because I loved writing the story. And all the good things that came since then were wonderful, especially being connected to people like the folks here. But I have such a great feeling because I had so much fun writing.
Mike's thoughts really resonate. Like, I think when you're excited about something that's, there's like an infectiousness to excitement, to the things you're excited about. And like when you bring them to the page. And I think that's also just related to a sense of, honesty about what's exciting to you, what interests you, but also what's at stake for you, maybe personally, or at stake to the people around you, the people or life worlds that are precious to you. I think just holding a sense of honesty when you show up to the page, that's invaluable.
Yeah, I really resonate with what both of you said. And I would say one of the things that's always in my mind is there's so many people who feel scared of trying to write a story for the first time. People who I feel like there's so much really great fiction out there. And the thought that's always in my head is, well, your story hasn't been told yet. Like, don't be scared by the fact that there's so many things out there. So if you're someone who's like, I want to write a story, but I don't know where to start, try it. This might be a good first test to submit to Imagine 2200. And with that, I will turn it over to Torrey to really just real quick before we end, what is Grist looking for in future stories for the second year? And how can people follow Grist and tune into Imagine 2200 as the second year kicks off?
Yeah, thanks for that. Well, first I'll say is that since everything went so well last year and we really liked the stories that we received in the outpouring of people, one thing I do want to say is like, it's awesome to have these 12 stories as a collection, as like really beautiful stories that stand on their own. But what's another beautiful thing is that 1,100 people dreamed up like kind of hopeful what they believe are hopeful intersectional stories, and them being motivated to kind of like take that act, because to write a 3,000 to 5,000 word story is like you're all in, like it's like that's what you're doing for the next few months, right? So I really do love that aspect of the initiative, that we were able to activate people in that way. But for this year, so we didn't really change much, because the prompt itself we think is like ironclad in a lot of ways. Like this is what we're invested in, and we're not going to kind of switch around too much. One thing we did change that is different this year is intersectionality is how people like that is like, for me, it's a really good framing for, just looking at, if you're looking at the world, like my world is intersectional, like people's worlds are intersectional. But we did find that, many people kind of see that as like a academic word, even though it, like, to me, is like a real thing that's happening in the world. It's a lens that I use. It's like, I don't know. So what we're doing this year is one thing I've always been interested in some, actually, Aydah's story had some of this. There was cultural authenticity, right? We really want that to show up in the stories. And the reason I'm pushing in that direction, most of the prompt we kept the same, but that was one thing where we hope that intersectional stories show up, but we just like aren't advertising it in that way in the prompt, just to make a little bit of a change this year. Maybe next year we'll also add it. It's one of those things I care about, we care about. So it's not like we don't care about intersectionality. It's just like the way people live their lives. And it's a good way to, see the power dynamics in people's like lived experience. But by focusing on cultural authenticity, what we're hoping is that, like I had this line that I would say is like, for Black folks, like my grandmother had like the plastic on her couch. And like, if you inserted that into a story, like I kind of know that like someone who told that story lived that, like that's just one tidbit, but I want more cultural artifacts like that infused into the story so that you can feel comfortable, like you're living in that person's world for one. And then if you have lived that life, it just feels comfortable, like some good food that someone has made you a million times. That comfort food. So that's one place that we did make a change. So if you're listening because you are interested in figuring out like what kind of story, if you're, push in that direction, but then all the other things that we had before, which is, leaning in the direction of hope, characters that are resilient and have agency as well. And then another thing that had always been a part of it, but we're emphasizing a little bit more, is decolonization, right? Decolonizing hope. When we were talking about hope and like what it looks like, look at hope from different cultures and places in how they represent hope. And you'll see that the Western style of hope is very different than kind of an Eastern or Middle Eastern. It varies from place to place. So decolonizing hope so that it's a little bit more realistic is something that we're interested in. So if you're interested in the contest and you want to find out more details, they've been dropping, the Ohio Environmental Council has been dropping links, but you could go to grist.org and then make your way to the Fix button, F-I-X, and on the front page there, you'll be able to find some links for the Imagine 2200 contest. You can also just look up Imagine 2200 and you'll get a ton of information on it as well. Yeah, and the last thing I guess I'll say is that this contest, this initiative has deep groundings, or at least when I was writing the prompts and kind of thinking about it, Solar Punk, shout out to those folks who've been creating really amazing climate solution focused and equitable stories for a long time that aren't utopian, I would say. Like, not that some of them are, but it's so then in Afrofuturism. So those are some places in Hope Punk, which is a lot small genre. But yeah, instead of grimdark, we wanted to go Hope Punk with this.
Thanks, Torrey. So Aydah and Mike, any real quick final thoughts from you, but then also how can listeners read more of your stories beyond Imagine 2200 or other things that you're doing? Are there any things that you want to share? Feel free to uplift those. You can put them in the chat as well, but just, what are any final thoughts as we close out?
Here, I'll just, yeah, I'm just sorry. Now that I've made it a thing, that you're just too wonderful, Aydah. You can find me online at magicmikewrites.com, which I used the name before the stripper movie, but it has helped my search results. So I'll say, and it's unfortunate, but it's not unfortunate, it's actually really great, but there's a famous Mike McClellan bass fisherman. So if you Google Mike McClellan gay, you always get me, but if you Google Mike McClellan, you get the bass fisherman. So just remember Mike McClellan gay, and you'll always get me every single time. It's great. So I think I've won the gayest Mike McClellan contest. So that is where you can find me at Magic Mike's on most places. I'm on a Twitter break because I'm supposed to be finishing a project, but I still check everything way too often. And thank you.
I don't have any final thoughts. You can follow me on Instagram. My link tree has linked to some of my other writing. It's Aydah_M_Patterson. Thank you.
Thanks, both of you. So, well, I hope everyone will join the OEC in thanking Grist, Torrey, Aydah, and Mike for joining us today. Hopefully discussion has inspired you to read more climate fiction or possibly even write your own climate fiction story. And I hope everyone continues to consider the power of narratives, whether fiction or nonfiction, to change the hearts and minds of people to act collectively to solve the climate crisis. If this is your first time joining an OEC event and an OEC Emerging Leaders event, we hope you'll stay connected to participate in other exciting opportunities like this. Follow us on social media, join our mailing list, and I would encourage you all to follow Grist, Imagine 2200, and as well as the work of Aydah and Mike. So I think that's it. Thank you all for joining us today. We're ending right at 1:15, so look at that.